Thank you for joining us for the first Global Middle East Seminar Series panel for the fall 2021 semester. We're very happy to have you back after the summer break. If you are new to the series, the Global Middle East Seminar is a series of panel discussions seeking to bring together scholars and experts from around the world to present new research findings and debate critical questions on Middle Eastern history. GMES, as we refer to it, is a product of the partnership between the History and Public Policy program at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., which I'm delighted to direct, and the Center for Russian Studies at Bilkent University in Ankara, Turkey. The seminar presents History and Public Policy and CRCS's shared goal of developing a strong collaborative network of scholars dedicated to advancing the study of Middle East history. The new series is designed in part to mitigate some of the challenges scholars, researchers are facing at extraordinary times like these, in the midst of when the world is in the midst of in the grip of a global pandemic, by bringing together people who are otherwise not be able to attend a conference hosted in a far part of the world. Additionally, with archives, libraries, and other institutions largely close to the public, the ability to share one's work with the community of scholars and experts becomes all the more important. This past spring, we came together for 5 panels featuring some of the leading experts in the field of Middle East history to discuss topics ranging from Turkish-Soviet relations during and after World War II to the use of chemical weapons in the 20th century, to the history of nuclear politics in the region. This semester, we are very excited to present you with 4 more discussions, beginning with today's exploration of the history of the US-Iranian relationship. I am delighted, no, I'm thrilled that we can feature today Worlds Apart, a documentary history of US-Iranian relations, 1978 to 2018, edited by 2 friends and colleagues of mine, Malcolm and Byrne. Worlds Apart covers the acrimonious US-Iran relationship from the 1979 revolution and hostage crisis through the Iran-Iraq war and the spread of radical Islam, to 9/11 and the nuclear impasse, to the 2009 Green Movement and the Obama and Trump presidencies. It's a fantastic resource for scholars, policymakers, experts, students alike, and I very much look forward to our discussion today. Before I introduce our speakers, I would like to make a special thank you to everyone involved in putting this series together. From the Center for Russian Studies, I'm grateful for the partnership and support of its director, Honor Ishii, who will moderate the discussion later on, as well as Samuel Hurst and Eliza Georgi, both professors at Bilkent, and Liza will say a few words on behalf of Bilkent in a couple of minutes. From the Wilson Center's staff, we thank Byrne for helping to organize the series and our AV team for handling the logistics of running this virtual webinar, John Tyler, Tracy Fitzgerald, and Trian Burgess. Thank you all. Now, it's my privilege to introduce our speakers. Let me do this in the, I think, sequence they will speak, and then turn it over to Eliza and the speakers. First, Malcolm Byrne. He is the Deputy Director and Director of Research for the Non-Governmental National Security Archive based at George Washington University. Since 1998, he has directed the archive's Iran-US Relations Project, which aims at a multinational, multi-archival approach to the history of the 2 countries' relations since World War II. Among his books is the award-winning Mohammad Mossadegh and the 1953 coup in Iran, co-edited by Mark Gazarowski, and Iran-Contra, Reagan Scandal, and the Unchecked Abuse of Presidential Power. Delighted, Malcolm, to welcome you to this GMES. He will be joined by Mr. Byrne, who is a program coordinator with the History and Public Policy program at the Wilson Center, where he supports the Nuclear Proliferation International History Project, NPIHP, and the Non-Proliferation Forum, co-organized with Los Alamos National Laboratory and the Cold War International History Project. Byrne Byrne also is leading a project to expand the program's work on the contemporary history of the Middle East and to expand access to sources on Middle Eastern history. Before coming to the center, Kian earned a bachelor's degree in history from Kenyon College and studied Persian at the Dakota Institute in Tehran. Finally, we're delighted to welcome as commentator to our panel today, Professor Narges Bajoli. She is assistant professor of Middle Eastern Studies at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. She's an award-winning anthropologist, scholar, and writer whose research focuses on the intersections of media and power in Iran and the United States. Her first book, Iran Reframed: Anxieties of Power in the Islamic Republic, published in 2019, studied the Islamic Republic's regime's cultural producers based on research with a number of media producers in Iran. The book won the 2020 Margaret Mead Award, the 2020 Choice Award for Outstanding Academic Title, and a silver medal in the 2021 Independent Book Awards for Current Events. Professor Bajoli's new project includes studies of the US use of sanctions, the use of chemical weapons in the Iran-Iraq War, the US use of sanctions, and Nightline's nightly coverage of the Iran hostage crisis. Welcome, Professor Bajoli. Now to Eliza Gorge, who will say a word on behalf of our partners at Bilkent, and then over, I think, to Malcolm Byrne. Eliza, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christian. It's a pleasure to be here, and I would like to extend my gratitude to all the panelists and to the discussant for joining us today. I would like to send a note of welcome on behalf of Bilkent Center for Russian Studies. Our goal is to conduct cutting-edge research on Russia, Eurasia, and Eastern Europe. We are hosted within the Department of International Relations at Bilkent, and we bring together a dynamic group of scholars and students focusing on this area, but also engaging with the history of the 20th century and 21st century. We regularly organize academic events, including workshops, seminars, as well as broader events for the public. Our strength is the geography of the place, and also Russian-Turkish relations, which we believe are a crucial part of our agenda, and we are equally committed to contributing to informed debates about a broader region and how this plays a role in international affairs. I would like to extend again our thanks to the Wilson Center for their partnership, and we look forward to a productive and stimulating semester and events and workshops ahead this year. Thank you very much.
Right, Malcolm, would you like to start? Or
sure.
Kian, Malcolm, who starts off?
Age before beauty. Yeah, I'm going to just start with a couple of words about the book, the idea behind the book, and then we're going to sort of tag team and talk about different sections of the book, get into the details and the things that the findings that we made and the documents that we chose. So why did we decide on this book? First of all, just to clarify for viewers, this is a documents collection. It is not a treatise. It's not a monograph. It's a collection of declassified documents that is designed to allow the voices of the people who made the policies, both in Iran and the United States, to speak for themselves, to kind of let us go back through a wormhole in time and see how those people made their decisions and how we got to where we are today. So why did we do this? The sort of short answer, first answer is that we were going through a pandemic, and this was a great project for both of us to sort of build on what we do in our day jobs and build it around those jobs, use our experience and our collections of documents at the Woodrow Wilson Center and at the National Security Archive, which for those who don't know us, we are a non-governmental nonprofit organization based at GW University. And we decided that this was a good time to put together a collection like this because this is 2020. And regardless of who was going to win the US presidential election, it was clear that we were at a turning point in the relationship with Iran, no matter who won. And it also occurred to us that here we were once again in a position of kind of a vast, fog over the issues. How is a person who hasn't necessarily spent many years of their lives or their careers studying these issues supposed to understand where we are and where we're going from here? Things were going to change in Iran as well with the 2021 presidential elections coming up. There was just a lot of uncertainty. We felt like we were back at square one, essentially. And so this was an attempt to pull together resources, primary sources that could cut through the spin, the third-party analyses, and as I say, let the people who got us to where we are speak for themselves. And so the book focuses on documents, but it also includes introductory essays to each chapter. Chapters are broken up by decade. It also very helpfully includes what we call head notes, document descriptions for every individual document out of the 62 records that we've included. So those head notes provide context, highlights, a little bit of understanding of what the significance of each of the documents is and why we chose it. It could have been 662 documents, as Keon will attest, but the people at Cambridge University Press were very wise to ask us to keep this limited to something that was manageable, digestible, and affordable. And so we tried to keep to their idea and produce something that people could handle. And so it was a great project, a lot of fun, and we hope it'll produce some good, interesting reading, even for experts who know the topic so well. They may find some surprises there in the documents that we've selected. And let me just quickly end with a word of thanks to especially the Iran experts who advised us along the way. We know the American documents pretty well. Keon knows the region in terms of its archival access, but we relied on the help of a number of people with real Iran experience, language skills, who helped point us to some really interesting materials on that side. So I think I can turn it over to Keon now for his take.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm much more used to being on the other side of these panels, either with my camera off and muted or in the audience. So it's a thrill to be here with everyone and to have a chance to talk about a project that I actually got to work on. Thank you to everyone at CRS, at HAP, at the Wilson Center, to the Wilson Center AV team, for putting all this together. And of course, thank you to my dad, Malcolm, for working with me on this really great project for the last year and a half. So for my part of the presentation, I'd like to kind of get into a little bit of our approach for the first two chapters and discuss specifically some of the key documents and takeaways that we had for the early periods of the relationship. Chapter 1 covers the shortest timeline in the book, technically beginning in 1978. Although there's a brief preface that covers the 2,500 years of Iranian history before that, and then goes through Reagan's inauguration in 1981. Chapter 2 begins technically slightly before then with the Iraqi invasion in September of 1980, and then goes through 1988 and the end of the war, and Khomeini's famous letter announcing the ceasefire and the end of the war then. We chose to divide the first 10 years of the relationship into two chapters for a couple of reasons. One of the main being that there's just too much going on in the first couple of years of the revolution. It obviously requires a number of books, let alone just one book, let alone just one chapter. But we just felt that it required more focus than to be kind of pushed together with another chapter. It's also a time where you see many of the trends and themes that will play a role in the relationship become established. In the 1980s, after that, in the chaos of the Iran-Iraq War and the Lebanese Civil War and the other issues going on, many of these cycles and conflicts that define the relationship begin to become set in stone. Iran moves more definitively towards a hard line, and the US, and particularly future presidents, see the political cost of trying to engage with Iran, and the stakes on both sides are raised. So to start with chapter 1, our goal was to figure out how to introduce these key themes and questions from the first couple of years in about 10 documents. I can imagine there are a lot of historians out there who can sympathize with how daunting a task this is. But we went for it, and I'm very pleased with I think we ended up with about 12, something like that, that really cover a number of different aspects of the period. So we tried to have each document represent either context, introduce a theme, or add something new to the historiography. One of the questions that people still grapple with today is how could the US be caught so unaware? And then an extension of that is, was it all Jimmy Carter's fault? If you look at the first couple of years of Carter's presidency, and especially at a lot of the intelligence reports from that time, it honestly just looks like a lot of the previous decades of US policy towards Iran. There's a lot of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And for Carter, as much as for any other president during the Cold War, the Soviet Union is really looming over pretty much every foreign policy choice at the time. And countries like Iran just don't rate. SALT II, Camp David Accords, Panama Canal, China, these are all kind of major developments happening at the time. And while Iran is deteriorating, you still have the Shah, who's been a rock for the past 25 years, has had his ups and downs, but has come through it. And you can see how Carter, who's still kind of new to the presidency and trying to figure out how to handle a lot of these major Cold War issues of the late 70s, would just want to rely on him to kind of resolve the issue and focus on these bigger problems. When everything does finally fall apart and it becomes clear that the Shah is not going to be able to fix the problem, and the White House finally narrows its focus onto the events, there are a lot of questions that they have about who the key figures are and where they fit in the puzzle. Again, you can see issues with the lack of prioritization, and you even have senior White House officials at one point having to ask what an Ayatollah is, and having to have that explained to them in a meeting at this point, already deep into the revolution. The US's responses to developments on the ground are constantly plagued by this lack of understanding. So another one of our goals is to show, in addition to what actually happened, how the US could get to this point, and as well, how Iran got to this point. We also wanted to explore another somewhat controversial question. Did the US try to overthrow the government in another coup like 1953? It's probably seems pretty obvious to many of us sitting here today that that's of course ridiculous, that we never tried anything like that. But it was a major factor in the Iranian thinking and at the time, and played a role in the motivations to take over the embassy, which is of course a huge turning point. But there's also a lot of nuance to that question, and I'll kind of get into that in a little bit when discussing the actual documents. There's also the revolutionaries themselves. We want to kind of represent them and tell their story, or at least let them tell their story. Who are they? Where did they come from? I think this is an element of the revolution that, for those who are not experts, might be missed. Again, there's a lot of kind of detail that people don't realize. Everything kind of falls under the shadow of Khomeini. He's the face of the revolution. Of course, it's the Islamic Republic. It's an Islamic movement. But this was not always a guarantee. There were a lot of other key figures and key movements involved that all played a role in the shaping of events and eventually sort of the shaping of the country, although of course the Islamists do end up taking over. Chapter 2, a lot of these same questions or themes continue to develop, and we try to build on those. but we also see the addition of new issues, for instance, Iran's support for terrorism, the US's involvement or not involvement in the Iran-Iraq War, and famously Reagan's role in the Iran-Contra affair. During this period, you really get to see the Islamic Republic as we know it today take shape. The horrors of the war with Iraq and terrible attacks by leftist groups like the Mujahideen al-Khalq cast the revolution in sort of a life or death struggle for the Iranian leadership in very real terms. Then when the US and the rest of the world don't react to these problems, to these atrocities, really, Iran's leadership really builds itself, kind of defines itself as an us against the world and creates that mentality. So you can still see that playing a major factor in all of the discussions and all the rhetoric today. But you also see here another theme that we really start to introduce, but becomes a major theme in the last few chapters, which my father will talk about. But that's despite all the enmity, despite all the rhetoric, despite all the violence that's enacted on both sides, both camps at some point, to some extent, are willing and do come to the negotiating table. Even in the middle of the most intense period of conflict, I think of the relationship in the mid-'80s, you've got the tanker war, the Lebanese civil war, representatives from the US and from Iran sit down and try to work out a deal. The parameters and motivations behind this deal are of course pretty questionable, and it's not entirely clear how far up the chain the Iranian delegation actually was. It was pretty high on the American side, but there were conversations between these two, and there was a willingness on both sides to sit down and negotiate. And I think that's a pretty interesting theme that, again, if you're not familiar with the subject, you may not realize. So without any further ado, I'd like to get into some of the good stuff, the actual documents themselves. The whole point of the book is to put the documents forward. So if you will bear with me, I just want to kind of run through some of the key documents in the first two chapters that we thought were particularly interesting and worth noting, and hopefully will serve as a teaser for the rest of the book. The first document of the book is a very interesting one. It kind of engages with several of these issues that I've just brought up and that we deal with in the chapter, and that's primarily around the US's preparedness for the revolution. This document is a CIA intelligence report titled Iran in the 1980s. It's from August 1977, so obviously looking forward into the next decade. It's a very long report. It has a lot of information on the current state of Iran, its economy, its political situation, its military capability, et cetera. But on the, I believe it's the first page, it makes four very kind of interesting predictions that, of course, come with all of the caveats you might expect from a career intelligence officer. So one is the Shah will be an active participant in Iranian life well into the 1980s. Two, there will be no radical change in Iranian political behavior in the near future. Three, Iran will not become involved in a war that would absorb all of its energies and resources. And four, oil will continue to dominate the Iranian economy. I think even H.W. Bush might be a little disappointed with the batting average of that prediction, but as funny as it is to kind of look at this report and point to all of the incorrect predictions, if you actually go through the rest of this very long report, it's pretty accurate. I mean, it's pretty incredibly accurate, actually, in its assessment of kind of the major threats to the Shah's authority, its coverage and explanation of the major political forces that exist in the country. And at one point, it even outlines how a singular figure from the religious right could conceivably rise up, build a cult of personality, and lead an insurrection against the Shah. So it really shows how much more of an art than a science intelligence gathering can be, and especially intelligence reporting. If someone were to read this report and see the first four bullets, the predictions right there, and use that as its as their kind of the core of the information of the report, you could see how they would say, oh, Iran's fine, we're okay, and move on to the next issue. Another record from CIA later on in the chapter is called the Shah's desire to reside in the US. And this gets to the heart of another debate, whether Carter abandoned the Shah. this telegram from Bruce Langen, who's the chargé d'affaires in the embassy in Tehran, gives his own review of the situation now that the Shah has left and the new provisional government, the PGOI, has been established. Iran is in a state of chaos. Carter and his team are reeling. They're trying to get a foothold, trying to salvage something from this whole situation, and trying to build this relationship with the new government as it stands. And in comes this request from the Shah to gain access to the US so that he can get treatment for his cancer. Coming back to this question, did Carter abandon the Shah? If you look at Langen's telegram, he gives a pretty clear and extremely prescient explanation of what will happen if Carter lets the Shah into the US. He says bluntly that this will upset everything that they've been working on with the new government and would likely put American officials in Iran at risk. Carter, on the other hand, is being pressured by hardliners in his own administration, like Brzezinski, as well as many supporters of the Shah who are arguing, again, kind of from a Cold War position, saying that if you do let the Shah just die in a foreign country and you don't give him the support that he's asking for, it sends a really bad message to the rest of our allies and kind of gives the Soviet Union a little bit more opportunity to pressure us in some other countries. So maybe the Shah is gone, but you have to at least put up a little bit of a fight for him and to show our other allies that we will stick with you. Carter does end up letting the Shah in, and you have one of the major flashpoints of the revolution, of the relationship, and the storming of the embassy and the takeover of the embassy, and the hostage crisis begins. So this is, again, trying to illustrate all the different factors that are in play in this decision-making, the motivations for people, and to show that, these people who are involved, they're not stupid, they're not crazy, they're human, and, they're dealing with a number of different issues that may not be immediately apparent on the surface. Another record that we chose to include for slightly different reasons is the famous William Sullivan cable, Thinking the Unthinkable. This is a little bit prior. This is the ambassador to the United States, who has been a longtime supporter of the Shah, or backer of the Shah at least, believing firmly that the Shah would be able to stick it out and get through the situation. He goes on vacation for 2 months in 1978, gets back in August, and the whole situation has changed. He doesn't change his reports initially. He still believes that the Shah can get through. But he, according to him, does some kind of on the ground reporting, asking people about how they feel about the situation. And by November 1978, he has decided that it may be worth considering hypothetically a world where the Shah is not in charge of Iran. And this completely throws the White House into turmoil. They, at this point, have not considered it a possibility. They've been hearing from a lot of their people that the Shah is strong and he can get through it. I don't believe at this point they know that he even has cancer. It's a pretty momentous document, and it's really the turning point in U.S. policy and their kind of realization that they need to prioritize the situation on the ground. It's one of these documents that we wanted to include because if you are going to be a scholar of Iran and the US-Iran relationship, or you already are, it's one of these documents you have to know about, you have to include. So we wanted to put that in, for the students, basically. Another document that's pretty famous, and it's a different kind of source. It's the communique from the Muslim students following the line of the Imam. These are the students who stormed the embassy after Carter agreed to take the Shah in. It's not really an archival record in the same sense, but it's also a really important kind of view into the Iranian perspective, or at least into the perspective of these students. Obviously, the hostage crisis is one of the most significant moments in the entire relationship. It's really where the enmity, at least on the US side, starts, much as the 1953 coup had done for the Iranians. And it's this moment where all of a sudden, all of the world is watching Iran. All of the world is looking at Iran, and especially the White House and the Americans are looking at this country that they've, for the most part, neglected. it's really important when you're studying the relationship to understand the motivations behind these kind of decisions and these actions. And right here, you have these students saying, with all of the world watching, this is why we did it. This is what we believe. It's of course meant for the public, for public consumption, but it's what they believe needs to be heard from their part. So we wanted to include that to kind of bring that perspective to the table. The last chapter, or the last document I want to talk about from chapter 1 is one of the most interesting that we included. It's a top secret record called Black Room Report. It's from November 20th, 1979, 2 weeks after the takeover. The Black Room is named for the interagency group that came up with the ideas for covert operations. So it's not a document that you really get to see very often. It's the opposite of the public communication. It's very, very, top secret and very difficult to get your hands on, even through FOIA and these other means. So what this particular document shows, a memo from Brzezinski about a meeting where Carter and this team, this Black Room team, are trying to figure out again how to get a grip on the situation. They haven't made any headway. They are now, of course, terrified about the safety of their people in the embassy. They don't know what to make of this Islamic group, these students, Khomeini, how they can again just reestablish some level of control over the situation. This is especially interesting because of the ideas that are put forward. They are on the more extreme side. They include mining the Gulf. They include bombing military, and I may have to double check this, but even economic targets to pressure the new and they believe fragile government into giving up the hostages. This is very much could be considered an act of war, any of these ideas, and they don't move forward with them. They don't make any concrete plans, but these ideas were considered, they were taken seriously, they were on the table. And it's really important to consider this and to look at things like the Heiser mission and his mandate, which again was not to foment a coup, but was to gauge the situation, was to see what the military officers were thinking, how they looked, and to kind of keep all of these options open to the Americans. When you look at the Iranians screaming and saying that, you know, the Americans are this great Satan and they're trying to overthrow the revolution, they're trying to destroy it. Again, it's easy to kind of throw that aside as ridiculous and say that America would never do that, or we didn't do it, or whatever. But we did consider it. We did look into the possibility. It was not just immediately written off as absurd, as ridiculous. And it's really important, you know, for policy people who are engaging with the Iranians to take their claims seriously. They're not made up from whole cloth, regardless of whether these things actually happened. They are, you know, at least, you know, somewhat realistic. So I'd like to just quickly move on to a couple of documents from chapter 2. They are very interesting for some similar reasons, and I think they continue to add the level of nuance that we're trying to bring to the US-Iranian relationship. The first is a document that was found recently by a good friend of mine, Alexandra Evans. So shout out Alexandra. She found them in the Ronald Reagan Library. It's a draft National Security Decision Directive, an NSDD, from July 13, 1981. This NSDD, like the Black Room Report, is really fascinating for what it shows us about how the White House, in this case under Reagan, perceived the relationship and potential courses of action. In this draft, just 6 months into Reagan's presidency, the SIG Senior Interagency Group is responsible for presenting policy proposals that may or may not make it up to Reagan, but they're beginning to shape the policy proposals for the presidency moving forward. In this draft, they list kind of their typical priorities for the region, fending off Soviet advances, protecting the flow of oil, the usual suspects on this subject, but they surprisingly also state a readiness to engage with the Iranians. At some point, they even mention the possibility of allowing allies like Israel to ship arms to the Islamic Republic. This is years before the arms for hostages deal and eventual Iran-Contra affair, 5 years, 4 years, thereabout. It's only a draft. but it is the SIG. These are very high up officials. These are not fringe White House actors. This is not Rogue Elephant. These are people at the very top who are very seriously considering this option. Again, it's not direct action, but it is showing the fact that these possibilities were real, that these were serious considerations taken at the highest level. And it goes very much against how the White House tried to paint the arms for hostages deal, at least initially. Finally, before I give up the floor, I just want to talk about a personal document that I found very interesting that is one of my favorites. It's a letter from Hussein Ali Montazeri to Khomeini in 1985. It's one of two letters that we have from his published memoir that cover the same subject, so we only put one in. But it is Montazeri, who at the time was considered Khomeini's heir apparent, giving his really unique and honest insight into the situation in the war with Iraq. At this point, he is basically begging Khomeini to consider changing his tactics, to pull back, to potentially even end the war now, believing it in 1985 to already be a lost cause. And he's actually goes so far as to blame the IRGC for promoting the war, for promoting the human wave tactics, for using the besieged to promote the IRGC's own political gain. There was a conflict within Iran at the time between the kind of standard army and the IRGC. It's, again, another subject that if you're not immersed in the relationship, you may not be aware of how these divisions lie within the Islamic Republic and at the highest levels, where these disagreements are and kind of who's on what side. It's very rare to be able to get to see these divisions play out, especially on an honest level. There's typically, and especially on the US side, a lot of just guesswork at who's, believes what, who's doing what, who's saying what. So when you actually get a letter from the heir to the Ayatollah and Ayatollah himself, and Khomeini kind of engaging in these disagreements and being honest about their perceptions of the situation, it's really fascinating to get that insight. So I'll leave it at that. I will pass it back to my dad, who can cover the rest of the book. Thank you again. I think you're on mute.
Sorry, folks. Thanks, Kian. I'm going to look quickly at the remaining chapters of the book, which are from the 1990s on, and then open it up to Nargis. So toward the end of the 1980s, two things happened that changed the picture in Iran dramatically. The first is the end of the Iran-Iraq War. The second is the death of Khomeini. The result of these events is a fairly dramatic opening up of society in terms of the start of a national debate, essentially, over the direction that the country should take after 10 years of revolution and war. Ironically, for observers, this you can see from looking at the documents, basically just made things that much more complicated. Different sets of political forces came to the fore, different locuses of power all began to go off in their own directions, giving the political scene almost a kind of a schizophrenic sense. It was really hard to tell what was going on behind the scenes. So as you go through the documents, particularly ones in this book, decade by decade, but starting in the 1990s, you see a couple of different patterns. On the one hand, you see a very significant initiative launched by then President Rafsanjani, aimed at opening Iran up to the outside world, primarily for commerce and trade, and obviously aimed at trying to rebuild the economy after the devastation of war. This is not an altruistic move to open to the West. The move is reflected in our collection in a really revealing memorandum of conversation between George H.W. Bush and Helmut Kohl of West Germany, of all places. Why is Germany important here? Germany is important because, according to one of Rafsanjani's proteges, years after the fact, in a conference that we helped to organize, his name is Hussein Mousavian. Mousavian says that Germany was where Rafsanjani wanted to locate this new initiative, start with a powerful economy in the West and hope to build outward from there. This was completely either ignored or just people in the West were unaware of this. Even though you can see in this conversation between Bush and Kohl that they are, very interested in seeing what the possibilities are. Somehow it doesn't percolate down. Another element of Rafsanjani's plan at this point is to try to end the attacks that are taking place against Westerners, especially the taking of hostages in the region by Hezbollah. And at first, the US side, this is again, George H.W. Bush, responds fairly positively to this. In fact, it's Bush who wants to help bring this to an end and mentions it in his inaugural address, as people know, talking about how goodwill begets goodwill. And this is interesting because it's even after the disaster of Iran-Contra, where Bush could, realistically have lost his shot at the presidency because of his role in the scandal, but he managed to escape. And so when you look at document after document that's been released by the Bush Presidential Library under the Freedom of Information Act, you see a very curious president who is, in the course of different conversations with heads of state around the world, is polling them as to what they know about what's happening in Iran and whether there are opportunities to break this long impasse that has been in place. So we include one of those. In addition to the Kohl Memcon, we have a conversation with the Sultan of Oman, Sultan Qaboos, who serves as an eager and very helpful intermediary for a couple of decades between these two countries, all the way up through the JCPOA. And yet, in spite of Rafsanjani's efforts, and for reasons that we go into in the essays, the two sides are never able to pull off the breakthrough that they both want. So while this is happening, you have the other strain, if you will, of Iranian behavior going on. So alongside Rafsanjani's attempts, there are elements in Iran that are simultaneously carrying out terrorist acts of various kinds and assassinations against different targets in the West, whether it's in Berlin, in Buenos Aires, in Paris, or elsewhere. They increasingly go after their own political enemies, and this is a quote unquote contribution that Rafsanjani wanted to claim. Is we're not killing you people, we're killing our own people. But that doesn't really fly for the West. And then the most damaging event in this period, in this vein, is the 1996 attack on the US Air Force facility in Saudi Arabia called the Khobar Towers. And that we have some documentation on and some analysis of. And so it's this combination of two, radically different patterns of behavior that produced another kind of schizophrenia in the United States this time, where the political leadership and official Washington and the American public just really don't know what's going on and can't make up their minds where they want to take things. Khobar, just to go into it in a little more detail, is a classic case where you have Bill Clinton facing tremendous pressure from not just the Republican Party, but from inside his own administration, where the intelligence community, within 24 hours, according to people that we have interviewed, they came to the conclusion that Iran was behind the attack, and they wanted to know what the administration was going to do about it. So Clinton is moved, at least to the point of ordering plans to be put in place, in fact, large-scale plans, military plans, in the event that they decide to act. And the quote that is made from Clinton is, he wants no pissant half measures. He wants really serious plans to be put into place. But remember that Clinton has already gone through a very confidence-shattering episode in Somalia. And so he really doesn't want to get involved in anything similar unless he has confidence that the American public is behind him. So he demands from his intelligence community irrefutable evidence that will fly in the public, in the court of public opinion. By the time he gets that information from the Saudis, a year has passed and the political landscape in Iran has changed dramatically. It's been turned upside down by the election of the pro-reform president Mohammad Khatami, who is, going around talking about creating a dialogue among civilizations. He's going on CNN telling the American people how much the Iranian public likes them. What are you going to do about that? Clinton immediately reverses course, gets interested in trying to follow up on this and see what he can do with it. And interestingly enough, he gets a honeymoon period from Republicans, from Israel, from others who have been diametrically opposed to any activity of this sort. He has a little window of opportunity to try to make something happen. But unfortunately, it doesn't work. He goes to the point of sending a rare direct letter to President Khatami, and we go into this in some detail. In fact, we have that letter. We've got it declassified through FOIA from the Clinton Library. We have that letter, and we have the Iranian response. So those are both in the book, and they're pretty riveting reading. Unfortunately, they show that this effort also blew up in everybody's faces, and among other things, it raises some important questions. Just as a general matter, how is it that even when two heads of state so clearly want something to happen, rapprochement to happen between the two countries, how is it that they were unable to make it happen? And we go into that topic as well. What you see in the course of looking through this time period is a repeating pattern on both sides of contradictory signals, indecision about how to react to what each side is picking up from the other, an uncertainty about even who you are dealing with and how you are supposed to deal with them. It's a whole story about how that you can watch unfold about how different US administrations had to learn step by step, how do you reach out to the Islamic Republic of Iran? It's a very interesting kind of seminar in statecraft and diplomacy. One of the big problems, of course, that comes up is that as powerful as the motivations are to try to do something positive, there is the inescapable reality that bad things are going on. One of the themes that we explore is the importance of kind of intangibles as obstacles in the relationship. It goes back to ancient history, Iranian history as a once great empire, Iran as a Shiite state, and all of the slings and arrows that they faced in that regard. The history of outside intervention by great powers that has created this this anathema for interference in Iranian affairs and attempts to impinge on their sovereignty by restricting their own access to their own natural resources, which was the case with oil back in the 50s. And you can translate that into the nuclear issue now, where there is such a public sense of a right to deal with the nuclear portfolio in a manner that they choose to pursue. These are intangibles, as I say. Unfortunately, both sides are also faced with the reality of a series of attacks, of a history of animosity between the two sides that has taken the form of either bombings in Beirut or at Khobar, or on the other side, U.S. support for Saddam Hussein, Iran's committed enemy in Iraq, the shooting down of the Airbus in 1988, the assassination of General Soleimani, if you want to include that. These are issues on both sides that inevitably take a toll, and it doesn't matter what our personal view may be of what happened in each of these cases. The point is that the perceptions exist, and they translate into extremely difficult obstacles to overcome because they become political issues. And then you have other factors come into play, such as the role of domestic politics, where it becomes a red line in both countries when one presidential administration wants to talk publicly about reaching out to this adversary that has arguably committed so many harmful acts against your own country. So what you see from looking at the materials is this record of obstacles being thrown up in the way of genuinely held desires on the part of every single American president since 1979 and every top leader in Iran responsible for foreign policy to try to overcome these obstacles and make something positive happen. So this includes Ayatollah Khomeini, it includes Khamenei, it includes Ronald Reagan, it includes Donald Trump, you name it. Every leader has found a reason of some kind to want to reach out to the other side. Maybe it's not for full rapprochement, maybe it's just for weapons to help in the war with Iraq, maybe it's just to keep the nuclear program in check to the extent that's possible. The point is that each leader has wanted to find a way to move out of this trap that both sides have found themselves in, and they have not managed to do that. Even now, where we have a new president whose national security staff is essentially a reunion of the band that brought us the JCPOA. I mean, how many of the senior figures in this administration were directly involved in the negotiations to reach that landmark agreement? And yet, even with that group in place, we seem to be in the same kind of no man's land, back to square one, after more than 40 years of this. And it's exactly to try to help explain how this can happen and to allow readers to sort of formulate some ideas about where we might possibly go from here, what worked in the past, what didn't work. Those are the reasons why we put together this book. So happy to talk in more detail after in the Q&A. Thanks.
Thanks, Malcolm. Before we turn it over to Professor Bajogli, let me remind our viewers that you can participate by using the raise hand function in the Zoom functionality, and we will call on you. Professor Ishi will call on you during the Q&A section, and or you can post your questions in the Q&A function on the top of my screen anyways. And we will, and Honor will pose the questions or comments to our panelists. With that, over to you, Nargis. Zoom room is yours.
Great, thanks so much for having me. And thank you to the Wilson Center, to this initiative. And also thank you for having it on Zoom. I'm 8.5 months pregnant, so I wouldn't have been able to make this in person otherwise. So hopefully no one in Q&A asked too stressful of a question, because I might then just have to rush into labor, but I'm just joking. I want to really congratulate both Malcolm and Keon for this great book. I thankfully have a hard copy of it. I am not a policymaker, but as a researcher and as an academic and as an educator, I think this is an amazing book, an amazing resource to have. For me, as I was going through it and reading it, and especially with all of the content that you all provide, not just the documents themselves, but at the very beginning, you have a section on how do you even read these kinds of documents, and how to read declassified documents and glossaries and things. And so I think if there are any educators, professors, teachers in the audience today, this is a really great book for using in the classroom to teach, especially those who are either new to history, or for someone like me who's not from the field of history but wants to teach how to read primary documents. I think it's a great resource to do that from. And then obviously, centering the documents themselves as the primary focus of the book with some short introductory material at the beginning, I think is really both as a reader of the book is really interesting to see, and the choices that you all made to include those in here. And I want to ask some of those questions. but also again as something for folks who are either students of US foreign policy, US foreign policy in the Middle East, Iran-US relations. It's something that you can really dig in, and you all provide really interesting discussion questions at the end of each of these chapters. So again, I wanted to really thank you all for putting this material together, because I can only imagine, knowing that the troves of material that you guys have all gone through and that you've made attempts at throughout the years to FOIA, that it must have been really, really hard to decide how do you curate this book. And that's one of the questions I have later too, is how do you take all the documents that you have at your disposal and decide what goes into something like this? But first I really want to start with this question of, Malcolm, I think it was you who said at the beginning, the continuous feeling of being back at square one, and you ended your talk with that as well. And why do you think that keeps happening, given that there have been these attempts at some forms of rapprochement over the years? But why do we keep going back to this feeling of being stuck at square one?
Thanks, Nargis. That's really one of the biggest questions. It's just a repeating endless cycle. And again, it doesn't matter if you're a Democratic president, a Republican president, an Ayatollah, a member of the IRGC, whoever. Nobody has found the solution to this problem. And I think it is on the one level a really complex set of reasons, but they boil down to a combination of intangibles and tangibles. So as I said, you have this difficult history that on the Iranian side that has taken Americans a long time to figure out. Not the experts so much, as Kian was saying. You read some of these CIA analyses and you go, that's a really good, prescient and cogent statement. It's the problem of breaking through a glass ceiling of a different kind and educating the policymakers. Kian also referred to the famous statement by Vice President Walter Mondale when he's being briefed along with the rest of the White House by CIA Director Stansfield Turner, and he has to stop the discussion of Khomeini's return to Iran by asking, what's an Ayatollah? They didn't know. To this day, there is tremendous ignorance. But as I also said, it's been interesting to look across the decades and across administrations to see how the level of knowledge and understanding has managed to increase. And again, this is on the policy-making level. Along with the intangibles, you have this bitter experience of knowing that your adversary has deliberately targeted you and killed your countrymen and women, whether it's deliberate in a bombing, accidental in an airplane shoot down, what have you. There are plenty of examples on both sides of direct and attacks that have resulted in death. That's very hard to overcome. But it becomes harder when you have to deal with domestic opposition in both countries. Iran has domestic opposition just as the United States does. The stakes are always higher. The rules are always tougher. But both sides, the leadership, even if they really, really want something to happen in terms of rapprochement, they have to try to overcome the politics at home and the emotions of the experiences, the mutual experiences, are a big part of what make it difficult. It's very easy for someone to stand up in the Majlis or in Congress and say, how dare you even consider reaching out to those murderous people who have done such damage to our country. And Iran, for as much as it lacks in full democratic practice, still has a democratic aspect to it. And the leadership has to respond to those kinds of considerations. And the US leadership has to respond in its own way to its circumstances. So it's a hodgepodge. it's a mix of tangibles and intangibles, and it's been a very difficult, just basic set of obstacles to overcome. I will say that what you also see in these documents is an increasing level of sophistication and even realism on the part of many of the experts involved. And I'll just single out William Burns, whose memos we include, at least 2 or 3 of them, of his briefings of the secretaries of state or higher level officials in different administrations. And you can see his effort to not only educate, but to present arguments that may sound like they are soft and dovish, and present them in a way where they can be defended in against attacks by hardliners. But they're very realistic, and they also show you how the next president is going to define their policy towards Iran. I'm thinking specifically of a document at the beginning of the Obama administration where Burns, and we have it in the book, where Burns essentially lays out a strategy for Hillary Clinton that he is proposing that the US follow. And when you look back at that, you can see how prescient that is and how closely Obama followed those guidelines.
So the part of what you're saying is that all of these external factors, whether they be domestic or other countries and lobbying and things like that, that might be involved in the relationship between the two countries, it helps to obviously influence a lot of what's going on. For me, because I'm writing a book on the chemical weapons usage during the Iran-Iraq War, I really focused on some of those documents in here. And it's interesting because you get one, and Malcolm, you and I have talked about this before, you get one perspective from what we're able to access, at least from the US documents, of specifically related to the chemical weapons, because a lot of it is still classified and or very difficult to find. But you get a different perspective of what's going on when you focus in on UN documents or letters that were sent to the United Nations and things like that. And so for me, this question of, and I think that this is an incredible resource, but how do you take into consideration, especially when you all were crafting this book, take into consideration that the Iran-US relationship is, as you're saying, it's not just the desires necessarily of those at the top, but so many other factors that go into play into creating these different stalemates that we have, or these moments of friction and paralysis in the relationship. And that at the same time, what we might have access to, as rich as it may be within US government documents, we also, the picture isn't fully completed. And of course, you can't ever write a complete picture of any of this stuff. But how did you all take that into consideration as you were crafting this and sort of think about that the multivalence of this conflict?
It was really, really tough. Kian can attest to this too, and he should jump in at any point. But we started with our known universe, which is actually pretty large. There's a lot of declassified American documents. There's a great trove of material, as you mentioned, from the UN archives. Kian and our other, expert advisors pointed us to a bunch of Iranian sources that are public. We were very sensitive to first trying to capture both of those sides. It's easier to capture the American side. We wanted to bring in the Iranian side as a kind of mirror image of the policymaking level. I mean, if you don't include the other side, you're half blind. So that's a non-starter. The problem is that access to archives, as Kian has written in his working paper for the Wilson Center, access to archives in Iran is really problematic for outsiders, and it has been. Even during the 90s, it was not very easy. So we had to rely on what is actually a pretty interesting collection of material that has been made public, either through memoirs of different officials, retired officials, or interviews that a very lively Iranian press has conducted for decades with different top-level officials, things of that sort. And then there is, as you say, there are other dimensions involved. There's the UN angle. There is the perspective of different, the rest of the P5+1, for instance, the role of Israel. There are all kinds of other aspects and perspectives that we wanted to include. I will say again that we were limited by our desire to be realistic here. This could have been easily a 1,000-page book and could have included some materials from other quarters. But we decided to make it reasonable that we should focus mostly on the US side of things and bring in the Iranian perspective as a sort of a reality check to see how American policies worked or didn't work, for example, and just to introduce that perspective that has been so lacking, for at least on the American side.
And following up on that, the American side, so, Kian, you talked about this great document at the very beginning of the book about US policymakers at very, very high levels, or government officials not even knowing what an Ayatollah was well into the revolution. And because much of the focus within the documents is obviously, as you just stated, Malcolm, for reasons that you just talked about from the US side, what can you all say as you went through these documents and as you all analyzed them and curated what goes into this book, the framework by which US policymakers approach Iran, especially because they were blindsided and especially because of the tone that the Iranian Revolution takes, both in its religious format after, during the revolution and after, and also because of the Islamic makeup of the country and of the government. The reason I'm asking this is that in my experience, sort of studying the discourse of US policymakers, US media, when it comes to Iran from the revolution onwards, it's that, well, first of all, the experts that are called upon to explain some of these things to US policymakers, a lot of them didn't actually have knowledge. They are early Islamic historians, not historians of Iran. They didn't really know the language. They kept referring to what was happening in Iran and what Khomeini was doing as like being similar to early Islamic history, rather than it being a completely actually new political development that didn't have any precedent in Islamic history, especially as Shia history. And so I find that as the years go by, so much of the ways in which American policymakers understand Iran harkens back to a particularly stale form of understanding of the country and of how it develops. And so, but that's from my perspective. I would love to hear it from your perspective. As you guys especially were going through these troves of material, did you see that evolve? Did you see a particular kind of stubbornness in how Iran is interpreted or not, from the perspective of, again, what you focus on here? And what has that also meant to our understanding of Iran? I mean, one of the things that's really interesting for me is having landed in DC a couple of years ago, is how incredibly narrow our understanding of Iran continues to be, unfortunately, and how it's focused on particular things that seem to not have expanded or become more complex, and therefore we miss a lot of the signals. Do you guys see that throughout the decades in the documents you're looking at? And where do you think, how do you think this framework is approached, and where does it come from?
Well,
big question. Go ahead, Kian.
Jump in. I think one of the key points that we kind of kept coming across, one of the key themes, is essentially an issue of prioritization, right? I kind of mentioned that a little bit in my presentation, particularly in the 70s and 80s. It's always the Soviet Union that's the highest priority. So Iran's importance is largely relative to its impact on the competition with the Soviet Union. So really, there's like only any sort of impetus, any motivation to learn about Iran and to kind of take its nuances and its kind of history into account as much as it can impact our situation. So in the 60s, in the early 70s, when it's not really a problem, Nixon and Kissinger are pretty happy to just let the Shah buy all the weapons that he wants, pressure Qatar, pressure Iraq, exist on his own because he's doing his job of keeping the communists down and keeping the Soviet Union at bay. As you move into the 90s and you have kind of more political issues and terrorism becomes kind of the main theme, then the interest is in Iran's sort of policies regarding that and people not wanting to expose themselves politically. So Clinton, especially in his first term, is really just does not want to touch Iran with a 10-yard stick because it's just, he saw what happened to Reagan, he saw what happened to Carter, and why would I involve myself in that? Their problem, I'll just leave it alone. I think it's only really with Obama where you see somebody like actually start to come in with a plan and have an idea for how to approach it. And it was obviously an incredible struggle to work with the Iranians in the first part to kind of overcome a lot of the resistance on the American side to actually negotiate and create what would become the JCPOA. But you do see the development over the period where it goes from complete neglect to people starting to realize that you can't avoid Iran, you can't ignore it, it's going to play a role. The problem is a lot of the time it's also just for each administration to learn on their own. And that's where you see these cycles where often a new president will come in, they will not know as much as maybe they should about the situation, about Iran, about who they're dealing with, and have to sort of learn through experience and through kind of interaction, often negative interaction, how to approach it. And then by the time they've learned those lessons, their term's up and they move on. I think there's also a distinction between people at the highest levels and the people on the ground. Again, you have people like Charles Nass who wrote an airgram who seems to really have his finger on the pulse and kind of have a grasp of what's going on and have an understanding. There are a lot of these intelligence officers and these people who have spent the time, who are there and do know, but they have a hard time making this connection with the higher brass, with these other people who, again, are prioritizing other issues. So even if the information does make it to the top, again, it's sort of relative to its importance to these other broader issues. So I think that's where you see a lot of the conflict, and again, where the kind of depressing part is that the shared knowledge doesn't seem to pass on from one administration to another in the way that you'd like. There isn't as much of the kind of learned lessons. It's every administration seems to have to learn the lessons themselves. And that's where you feel like our understanding is still paper thin. There are lots of people out there who really have an understanding and a really good grasp of what's going on, but they're not usually the people who get to make the final decision.
Yeah, I totally agree with all of that. I think a couple of other points that come up in these records are if you are approaching this as a president, this all depends on what your interest level is, what your outlook is. I mean, Obama was much more interested in pursuing rapprochement than George W. Bush was to begin with. And he and the likes of Cheney and Rumsfeld had no desire to understand anything further about Iran. This plays into another point, which is that I think what has happened over time is that the American side has viewed Iran through the prism of other subject areas like terrorism or arms control, which is how the JCPOA negotiators seem to look at things. So from that perspective, you want to know more about terrorism and what its dynamics are. Does it really matter so much what the Iranian historical picture is, that kind of thing. And then another point is that, again, totally agree. I think there are so many experts out there who really know their stuff, and some of their input gets registered, but not enough. But even the experts make assumptions. So you see a theme, just to pick one example, where George Cave, who was one of the only Farsi speakers, Persian speakers in the CIA in the 1970s and 80s, became part of the Iran-Contra affair against his will, but we include his report after his trip to Tehran in 1986, where he is left to wonder how it is that the Iranians couldn't just pick up the phone and tell Hezbollah to let the hostages go. Well, because they don't have that level of control over Hezbollah. Why is it that the Iranians are constantly talking about, lecturing everybody about their history and their greatness and the martyrs in their past and so on? Same question gets raised by Bill Burns after his first bout with Jalili, the Iranian negotiator in the 2000s. And the same questions, I think, come up when you are talking about Hamas or the Yemenis or whoever it is. There is an assumption by most people, I would put forward, that the Iranians must be able to control these people, and so therefore the fact that these attacks happen must be laid at the doorstep of Iran, when it simply is not realistic to expect that kind of full control in a relationship. Look at our relationship with the Shah. We couldn't even control the Shah, so how can we expect Iran to control its proxies as well?
Thank you so much. I want to turn it over to, I know there's audience Q&A, so I don't want to take
Nergis Hanım, I'm sorry for the Turkish pronunciation, Nergis Hanım. Thank you so much for the excellent discussion, and Malcolm and Kian, thanks. I hate to intervene, but we have about 14 minutes left, and there are some questions from the audience. And in case you're wondering who I am, I'm taking over the moderator duties from Christian Ostam, and we are the Center for Russian Studies at Bilkent University co-organizing the event. And there are a couple of questions from the audience, and given our limited time, Malcolm or Kian, you can jump and answer the questions in the order that you please. So Michael Goodman has made several interesting comments in the chat window, and he asks, why did the Revolutionary Guards never put any of the embassy hostages on trial, as had been repeatedly threatened? Which I think is a good question, and we could just start with that, Professor Goodman's question.
I would say that that's a little outside our expertise. It gets into the thinking of some secretive organizations in Iran, but I would venture to say that it is a sign that we have seen repeatedly for 4 decades of the Iranian government's desire not to cross any tripwires, not to escalate matters to a point where the consequences could be seriously dangerous for them. This goes against the popular idea in some quarters over time that Iran is run by irrational, crazy people. They are not, at least the ones who seem to be, in the position of true power. There is this constant tension that you can see in the documents and over time between these two poles that I talked about a little bit in my presentation, which are on the one hand, you have, this is a gross oversimplification, but those who are interested in opening Iran up to the world for various reasons, and those who are interested in pursuing the God-given mission that drove the formation of the Islamic Republic in the first place. And for them, for many of them, there is no compromise. You should take the war to the infidels, if you will. And I'm sure there was a lot of pressure to put those hostages on trial, but other voices prevailed in the interests of preserving, the state and the revolution.
Thank you, Malcolm. There's another question from an anonymous attendee. It says, apologies for raising this question again, as you may have covered it so far. We covered it already, but regarding the documents shared in Chapter 2, are they officially declassified? Additionally, with respect to the top secret kinetic options considered by the Carter administration, and given the current appetite for reviving the JCPOA by the Biden administration, do you prescribe any messaging strategy for the US to counter any potential disinformation campaigns generated either by Iran or perhaps other state actors who favor damaging US image in the international community. How can the US effectively counter the great devil narrative, given the revelations in chapter 2, is one of the questions. And given our limited time, can I please forward the final question from Victor Vahidi Moti, who says, thank you very much for the great talk. I'm an Iranian foresight expert who immigrated to the US in July about predictions of the 1979 revolution. As you can see here, the data shows it was a revolution of the rural against the urban. And I'm interested to know your take on this observation. So,
sorry, the take on what?
there is, and he shares a link, which, all right, so this observation probably follows the link there, which we don't have the time to read, about the predictions of 1979 revolution. As you can see here, the data shows it was a revolution of the rural against the urban. I guess,
Urban, okay.
yeah, so it's about the center versus periphery debate, I guess. And there's so why don't we start with these two? And there are actually two other questions. So, and we have a very limited time. So
I can just answer very quickly. The documents that we have, many of them have been declassified either through Time or through FOIA. I don't believe we have included any still classified materials. The Montazeri letter that I mentioned comes from memoir that's published in Iran by Montazeri. And there are a number of other documents like that come from memoirs. So in that sense, they're published that way. But most of the documents that we found, or my dad found in many cases, or our colleagues, were either released via FOIA or found through the archives.
I guess
I'm hesitant to get into the Biden prescription, but
there is a general and perhaps a more underlying question there, which is how can the U.S. effectively counter the great devil narrative given the revelations in chapter 2?
I would say that the only way that we have ever seen any progress in the relationship is through communication. I just, it's going to be very hard to win a PR campaign like this, especially in Iran. We just will not have any advantages there in terms of dictating the narrative. I think the only thing that you can really do in this case is just to, as hard as you can, try to open up some channels of interaction. I think in the early 90s, when they kind of opened things up to track 2 diplomacy, I think you see a little bit of success there. I think one of the big things whenever you're kind of interacting with Iranians, and Iranians, like the population, are getting to interact with the world abroad, I think you really kind of see the human side, the real side of the Iranian people. They're obviously an incredibly charming, brilliant, interesting population. And so the more you get to see them, the more you like them. And I think that goes both ways. I think for Americans, the more that we can sort of show all of our sides and not just the diplomacy, policy, economic side, but actually kind of interacting and commingling. I think that's the only real way that you can kind of make any headway. I don't think disinformation campaigns or anything like that is gonna get the job done to the same permanent extent.
Mm-hmm. And Dan Lieberman from our audience asks, comments and then asks, I do not understand, in the last years, the United States has murdered an Iranian leader, shot down one of the civilian planes, sanctioned them to near economic collapse, had friends, quote unquote, murder their nuclear scientists, sabotaged their nuclear efforts, and lost more. What damage has Iran inflicted upon America? Seems if we want to untangle this adversarial relationship, we should make the determining moves and change our attitude, which is the common bit. The ball is entirely in our court. That's the
I don't think I could go that far because I think both sides have a lot to answer for. Both sides see their own actions as totally justified and often in response to bad acts by the adversary. But certainly there doesn't seem to be much question that Iran was either behind or approved of things like the bombings in Beirut in the 1980s. The Khobar Towers is still, it's a little dicey in terms of, who you ascribe blame to, but they acknowledge a number of acts that have taken place that have either targeted Americans or Westerners or otherwise violated international law. So it's hard to excuse just one side. Well, I'll stop there.
No. We still have time, I think. So Tad Ling says, Kian, and he doesn't cite you, Malcolm. Excellent presentation. I will read the book with interest. I believe Robert Jervis did a post-mortem of the IC's failure in Iran before the revolution, which has since been declassified. Was that included in your book or helpful to your understanding? I think the question is for you, Kian.
I appreciate you recognizing the true genius behind the book. I think it's important somebody said it. We did look through Robert Jervis's book. I don't believe we have any documents or anything from that. I don't know if you can confirm that. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but it definitely played a role in our background research and sort of understanding of kind of the history, when we were going through, especially on my part.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. We have the actual study, the declassified study, which he used to put into a book, but I think the version that we have is actually more fully, more unredacted than previous versions. Mm-hmm. And there are also a lot of kind of responses, internal CIA responses to this assessment by an outsider of their work. And those are available, but not in the book. If this had been the 500-page version of the book, then we definitely would have included them. But they did inform us, as Kian said, especially in terms of trying to understand whether the failure to predict the revolution was an intelligence failure, was it a policy failure, a failure of imagination, exactly what. And so Jervis's comments are germane to that.
And it's a big part of the point of this book is to encourage people to go find these other sources and to kind of read them themselves and to read the figures. Bill Burns is another guy who's just a tremendous resource and somebody who's really fascinating to read about and to read his works and especially as he continues to be relevant today.
Absolutely. We should add that we did a lot of interviews. We, either separately or together over time, our organizations have done a lot of interviews with people like Bill Burns and Wendy Sherman and other key participants going back to George Cave and Bud McFarlane and people who took part in the 1980s. And we've also organized a number of conferences, the National Security Archive and also the Wilson Center, either again jointly or separately, that have looked into some of these key events. So a lot of those materials also informed the text of our essays and our headnotes. We tried to give as many insights as we could based on the expertise and the personal experiences of the people involved.
All right, I think our time is almost up. I would like to take the opportunity to thank Nergis Hanım, especially Nergis Hanım, for participating in this discussion with her pregnancy and everything. Thank you so much for your valuable comments. And Malcolm and Kian Byrne. Professor Byrne, I've heard a lot about you, and I really do hope to meet you in person one day from various colleagues in the US. Iran has also been a significant part of my research. It's almost impossible to study Turkey without a significant knowledge of Iran in the area, and I'm sure that you will agree to that. I really find this. I found it to be an amazing and really thrilling book talk / discussion. Before ending this session, I'd like to take the opportunity to announce our next event, which is coming up on October 18th. It's about Turkey this time, and we'll go back in time and look at the global world order after World War I. Michael Reynolds from Princeton University and Alp Yenen from Leiden University will be joining us on a discussion of young Turks, and the event is called Rogues and Revolutionaries. And we'd like to keep the chronological scope of our discussion a little bit larger here. And thanking you again for your participation. And I look forward to seeing you guys in our next event. Thank you. And thank you, Eliza.
Yeah. Thanks,
Thank you, everyone.
Bilkent. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, really great.